The rain hammered against the attic window, each drop a tiny fist against the warped glass. It was a relentless, unforgiving rhythm, mirroring the frantic beat in my chest. The air hung thick and heavy, saturated with the scent of mildew and decay, a smell that had seeped into the very fabric of Blackwood Manor. I shivered, pulling my threadbare wool coat tighter around me. October had arrived with a vengeance, and the chill clung to everything, both inside and out. I hadn't expected the house to be this. The listing online had been vague, promising rustic charm and seclusion. It had failed to mention the oppressive sense of dread that permeated every inch of the place, the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. My name is Elias Thorne, and I'm a writer, or at least, I aspire to be. I'd come to Blackwood Manor seeking inspiration, a quiet place to finish my novel, a gothic horror piece steeped in the lore of crumbling castles and forgotten evils. Ironic, isn't it? I thought I was searching for the setting, but perhaps the setting had been waiting for me all along. The realtor, a nervous man named Mr. Abernathy, had practically fled after handing me the keys, his parting words a mumbled apology about the house being a bit drafty. He hadn't mentioned the unsettling portraits that lined the hallway, their eyes seeming to follow you, or the strange symbols etched into the stone fireplace in the library. I'd dismissed my initial unease as simply the product of an overactive imagination, a byproduct of my chosen genre. But as the days bled into nights, the unease had solidified into something far more sinister. I wasn't alone. The attic was the worst. I'd initially avoided it, drawn to the library and its towering shelves of leather-bound books. But last night, I'd heard the scratching. A low, persistent scratching that seemed to emanate from directly above me. Curiosity, and perhaps a morbid desire to confront my growing fear, had driven me to climb the creaking stairs. The single bare bulb hanging from the rafters cast long, distorted shadows across the cluttered space. Dust motes danced in the weak light, creating an illusion of movement. The attic was a repository of forgotten things, broken furniture draped in white sheets, moth-eaten tapestries depicting scenes of hunting parties and courtly love, and trunks overflowing with yellowed letters and faded photographs. The scratching started again, closer this time. It was a dry, papery sound, like fingernails scraping against wood. My heart hammered against my ribs. I scanned the room, trying to pinpoint the source, but the shadows played tricks on my eyes, turning familiar shapes into monstrous figures. Then I saw it. A small, wooden door, tucked away in the far corner of the attic. It was barely visible, hidden behind a stack of old steamer trunks. It was darker than the surrounding wood, almost black, and devoid of any handle or hinges. The scratching was coming from behind that door. I moved slowly, cautiously, towards the trunks. They were heavy, and the wood was brittle with age. It took several minutes of strained effort to move them aside, revealing the door in its entirety. A wave of cold air washed over me as I stood before it. The air was different, thicker, carrying a faint, metallic tang. It smelled old. Older than the house itself. I reached out, my hand trembling, and ran my fingers across the smooth, cold surface of the wood. There were no visible seams, no way to open it. It was as if the door had been fused to the wall, an integral part of the house's very structure. The scratching intensified, growing louder, more frantic. It was joined by a new sound, a low, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Whatever was behind that door was desperate to get out. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. What was this place? What had I stumbled into? This wasn't just a creepy old house, it was something else, something unholy. I knew I should leave. Run. Get as far away from Blackwood Manor as possible. But something held me back. A morbid curiosity, a writer's inherent need to understand, to unravel the mystery. I spent the next few days researching the history of Blackwood Manor. I pored over local records, newspaper clippings, and obscure historical texts. The information I found was fragmented and contradictory, but a disturbing picture began to emerge. The house had been built in the late 17th century by a man named Silas Blackwood, a reclusive scholar with a reputation for dabbling in the occult. Rumors circulated about strange rituals performed within the manor's walls, whispers of summoning ancient entities and consorting with dark powers. Silas Blackwood disappeared without a trace in 1723. Some said he had fled the country, fearing the consequences of his heretical practices. Others whispered that he had fallen victim to the very forces he had sought to control. After his disappearance, Blackwood Manor remained unoccupied for decades, gaining a reputation as a cursed place. People avoided it, claiming to hear strange noises and see flickering lights in the windows. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that a new family, the Whitfields, moved in. The Whitfields seemed to have broken the curse, living in the house for several generations without incident. But then, in 1938, tragedy struck. The entire family, husband, wife, and 2 children, vanished without a trace. The only clue was a single, blood-stained page torn from a book, found lying on the floor of the library. The house had remained empty ever since, until I arrived. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that the door in the attic held the key to the manor's dark history. It was a prison, a seal, containing something ancient and malevolent. And whatever it was growing restless. The scratching had become a constant presence, a maddening soundtrack to my waking hours. The moans were louder now, accompanied by a low, rhythmic thumping, as if something was banging against the door from the inside. Sleep offered no escape. I was plagued by nightmares, visions of shadowy figures lurking in the darkness, of grotesque creatures with glowing eyes and razor-sharp claws. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, convinced that something was standing over me, watching me. I started carrying a crucifix, a cheap, plastic one I'd bought at a roadside shop. I didn't believe in God, not really, but the crucifix offered a small measure of comfort, a tangible symbol of protection against the encroaching darkness. One night, I awoke to find the crucifix lying on the floor, the plastic cross snapped in half. I felt a presence in the room, a cold, suffocating weight that pressed down on me. I couldn't see anything, but I knew I wasn't alone. I scrambled out of bed and fled the room, my bare feet pounding on the wooden floor. I ran through the house, desperate to escape the oppressive presence that seemed to be closing in on me. I found myself back in the attic. Drawn there, like a moth to a flame. The scratching was deafening now, a furious assault on my senses. The moans had become screams, high-pitched and inhuman. The thumping was relentless, shaking the very foundations of the house. I stared at the door, mesmerized by the sheer force of the entity trapped behind it. It was so close, so desperate to break free. And then, I saw it. A hairline crack, spider webbing across the surface of the door. The wood was beginning to splinter, to give way. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the door wouldn't hold for much longer. I had to do something. But what? I had no weapons, no knowledge of ancient rituals, no way to combat the evil that was about to be unleashed. Then, I remembered the books. The library was filled with ancient texts, books on forgotten lore and forbidden magic. Maybe, just maybe, there was something there that could help me. I raced down the stairs, my heart pounding, and burst into the library. The room was cold and dark, the shadows clinging to the shelves like living things. I frantically searched the shelves, pulling books at random, scanning the pages for any mention of Silas Blackwood, of Blackwood Manor, of anything that could offer a clue. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Each second felt like an eternity. The scratching from the attic grew louder, more insistent. Finally, I found it. A small, leather-bound book, tucked away in the back of a shelf. The title was barely legible, but I could make out the words Liber Maleficarum, the Book of Evil. I opened the book, my hands trembling. The pages were filled with strange symbols and arcane diagrams, written in a language I didn't understand. But as I flipped through the pages, one passage caught my eye. It was written in Latin, but I recognized a few of the words: claustrum, spiritus, vinculum, sanguis, prison, spirit, bond, blood. The passage went on to describe a ritual, a way to strengthen the bonds that held a captive spirit, a way to reinforce the prison that contained it. It required a sacrifice, a willing offering of blood and soul. I stared at the words, my mind reeling. Was this the answer? Was this the way to stop the entity from escaping? But the price was too high. I couldn't sacrifice myself, not for this. I was a writer, damn it. I had stories to tell, worlds to create. I couldn't just throw my life away. But what choice did I have? If the entity escaped, who knew what horrors it would unleash upon the world? I couldn't let that happen. I closed the book, my decision made. I would perform the ritual. I would sacrifice myself to save the world. I gathered the necessary materials, a silver knife, a bowl of salt, and a vial of consecrated water. I arranged them on a table in the center of the library, my hands moving mechanically, as if guided by some unseen force. I took a deep breath and opened the book to the passage describing the ritual. I began to chant the Latin words, my voice trembling at first, but growing stronger with each repetition. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with an unnatural energy. The shadows danced and writhed, taking on grotesque shapes. I felt a presence in the room, a dark and malevolent force that seemed to be drawn to my ritual. I raised the silver knife and pressed the blade against my wrist. I hesitated for a moment, my mind filled with doubt and regret. But then, I thought of the horrors that awaited if I failed, and I pressed the knife deeper. Blood welled up, dripping into the bowl. I continued to chant, my voice growing weaker, my vision blurring. I felt a searing pain in my chest, as if something was tearing its way out of my soul. I gasped for breath, my body convulsing. And then, everything went black. I awoke to silence. The scratching was gone. The moans were gone. The thumping was gone. The house was still, silent, and utterly empty. I sat up, my head throbbing, my body weak and trembling. I looked around the library. The table was clean, the bowl empty, the silver knife lying on the floor. Had it all been a dream? Had I imagined the scratching, the moans, the ritual? I stood up and walked to the attic. I climbed the stairs, my heart pounding with trepidation. I reached the top of the stairs and stepped into the attic. The door was still there. The hairline crack was gone. The wood was smooth and unmarked. I reached out and touched the door. It felt cold and solid, as if nothing had ever been behind it. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I succeeded? Had I stopped the entity from escaping? I didn't know. I turned and walked back down the stairs, my mind filled with confusion and doubt. I wandered through the house, searching for any sign of what had transpired. But everything was normal, as if nothing had ever happened. I went back to my room and lay down on the bed. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the memories, the visions, the fear. I fell asleep. I awoke to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, barely audible. But it grew louder, more insistent. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I knew that sound. The scratching was coming from inside the walls. It was all around me, in every room of the house. It was relentless, maddening, driving me to the brink of insanity. I tried to ignore it, to block it out. But it was impossible. It was in my head, in my bones, in my very soul. I ran through the house, searching for the source of the scratching. But I couldn't find it. It was everywhere, and nowhere. I went back to the attic. The door was still there, still smooth and unmarked. But as I stared at it, I saw something that I hadn't noticed before. A faint, almost imperceptible outline, etched into the wood. It was a face. A grotesque, distorted face, with glowing eyes and razor-sharp claws. It was my face. And then I understood. The entity hadn't been trapped behind the door. It had been trapped in me. Silas Blackwood hadn't summoned it, he had become it. The ritual hadn't contained it, it had freed it. I was the prison. I was the seal. I was the monster. The scratching wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside my skull. The moans weren't coming from the attic. They were coming from my throat. The thumping wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from my heart. I ran to a mirror and stared at my reflection. My eyes were glowing red, my skin was pale and clammy, my features were twisted into a grotesque mask. I was no longer Elias Thorne. I was something else, something inhuman. I raised my hands and looked at my fingers. They were long and sharp, tipped with razor-like claws. I felt a surge of power coursing through my veins, a dark and malevolent energy that filled me with a terrifying sense of purpose. I smiled, a slow, predatory smile that revealed rows of sharp, pointed teeth. The writer was gone. The monster had taken over. And the scratching grew louder, more insistent, as I began to stalk the halls of Blackwood Manor, searching for my next victim. The pages of my unfinished novel were forgotten, replaced by a new narrative, one written in blood and despair. The rain continued to hammer against the windows, each drop a tiny fist against the glass. It was a relentless, unforgiving rhythm, mirroring the frantic beat in its chest. The transformation was complete. The manor had its master, and the master, his manor. The story wasn't over. It had just begun. The history of Blackwood Manor wasn't just a story to be written. It was a legacy to be continued. And I, or rather, it, was ready to embrace it. The faint scent of old paper, mildew, and something metallic filled the air, a cocktail of horrors that would soon become the norm. The chilling wind whispered through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it the echoes of screams long past, and the promise of screams to come. The house was alive, and I, the monster within, was its beating heart. The curse of Blackwood Manor had claimed another victim, not to be destroyed, but to be transformed, to be added to its grotesque tapestry of suffering. And as the scratching grew louder still, a new chapter in the manor's dark history began to unfold. A chapter written not with ink, but with blood, fear, and the unending torment of a soul consumed by darkness. The cycle would continue, the house would claim more victims, and the monster within would grow stronger with each passing year. Blackwood Manor was a prison, a hell, and I was its warden. And the scratching? It was the sound of the other prisoners, those who had come before, begging for release. But there would be no release. Only endless suffering, and the chilling knowledge that they, too, would one day become the monster.